Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we examine a story that didn't just unfold on the battlefield, it unfolded in the cold, in the silence, and in the precision of a nation that understood its enemy better than the enemy understood itself. Welcome, and thank you for joining me. What you're about to hear is not simply a military analysis. It's a lesson in timing, strategy, and the brutal simplicity of letting nature fight alongside you. Because Ukraine didn't rush, Ukraine didn't panic, Ukraine waited for winter to arrive, and then crippled Russia's $17.5 billion logistics backbone in a single sweeping chain of blows that Moscow never saw coming. Ukraine weaponized winter long before the first snowflake touched the ground, and that is what makes this strategy so remarkable. This wasn't improvisation. This wasn't a desperate gamble. This was a cold, calculated understanding of the battlefield, the terrain, and the psychology of an invading army that believed winter would work in its favor. The hook here is simple but powerful. When an opponent thinks the season protects them, the boldest thing you can do is turn that season against them. Ukraine didn't just prepare for winter. Ukraine prepared winter itself to become a battlefield partner, a force multiplier, a silent co-commander operating alongside its troops without firing a single bullet. As temperatures dropped, Ukraine recognized something Russia had forgotten. Modern warfare is no longer decided by who survives the cold, but who knows how to use the cold to shape the conflict. While Russian convoys stretched across exposed terrain, fighting mud, frost, and mechanical breakdowns, Ukraine studied them. Every slowdown, every rerouted supply truck, every fuel depot that couldn't be fully insulated against freezing, each one became a point of leverage. Russia believed the same winter that once crushed Napoleon and Hitler would cushion its operations in Ukraine. But Ukraine understood that historical victories do not automatically repeat themselves, especially against an enemy equipped with drones, satellite surveillance, and the agility to strike with precision at any moment. And that was the moment Ukraine decided to turn patience into strategy. What makes this so engaging is the almost cinematic tension of waiting. Ukraine's commanders watched the encroaching cold like predators watching the shadows. They didn't need to rush. They didn't need to force a breakthrough. They simply needed Russia to become slower than usual, more predictable than usual, more strained than usual. And once the cold hit hard enough, the transformation began. Engines clogged with frost, trucks stalled on icy roads, fuel deposits thickened, and entire convoys began to crawl instead of move. That's when Ukraine struck, not randomly, not widely, but at the precise nodes of vulnerability that winter had already weakened. Imagine hitting a machine at the very moment its gears lock up. That is what Ukraine did. The brilliance of this approach lies in how understated it was. No dramatic troop surges, no massive armored offensives. Instead, the hook was subtlety, using the season as a silent saboteur. Winter wore down Russia's confidence. Ukraine used that erosion to launch pinpoint attacks that had maximum effect with minimum effort. By hitting fuel storage at the coldest hour, Ukraine guaranteed that what wasn't destroyed by the strike would freeze beyond usability. By targeting convoys already moving at half their normal speed, Ukraine ensured that a single destroyed truck could block an entire road for hours. And by striking at night when temperatures were at their harshest, Ukraine forced Russia into a constant cycle of costly, exhausting recovery efforts. What many analysts fail to realize is that winter warfare is not about surviving the temperature. It's about understanding the rhythm it imposes on the enemy. Ukraine mastered that rhythm. It studied the exact temperature ranges when Russian diesel engines were most likely to fail. It measured how long it took for Russian repair crews to respond in freezing conditions. It calculated the degree to which frozen terrain changed troop movement patterns. Every small detail became an opportunity. Every opportunity became an abrasion on Russia's logistical system. And every abrasion became a weakness that Ukraine could pierce with precision strikes. This wasn't just smart military planning. It was psychological warfare. As Russian troops felt the cold tightening around them, as they saw their supply trucks immobilized and their fuel turning to sludge, fatigue set in, doubt set in. The morale damage was immense. Ukraine exploited this with masterful timing, launching strikes during the moments when Russia was most overwhelmed by environmental stress. The cold wasn't just freezing metal, it was freezing confidence. That's the hook that makes this key point so gripping. Ukraine didn't just survive winter. It turned winter into a weapon so sharp that Russia never realized how deep the cut was until the bleeding had already begun. Russia's $17.5 billion logistics backbone didn't collapse because Ukraine had more firepower. It collapsed because Ukraine understood exactly where Russia was weakest, exactly when those weaknesses would widen, and exactly how to strike so that every dollar of damage multiplied into $100 of disruption. The hook here is simple. When an army depends on long, fragile supply lines stretched across unforgiving terrain, you don't need to destroy the army itself. You only need to break the arteries that feed it. Ukraine did not just attack Russia's logistics system. It orchestrated its downfall with a level of timing and precision that turned billions in infrastructure into little more than frozen, burning wreckage. The story becomes even more compelling when you consider how heavily Russia relied on these logistics networks. For months, Moscow poured fuel, ammunition, armored vehicles, spare parts, and essential supplies into a massive logistical apparatus designed for a fast, overwhelming advance. But wars that are expected to be quick often transform into wars defined by endurance, and endurance requires a system that can withstand stress. Russia's could not. Ukraine recognized the growing strain as winter approached, convoys taking longer routes, fuel depots filling beyond safe capacity, rail hubs overloaded with supplies that couldn't move quickly enough. These vulnerabilities were not hidden. They were exposed, obvious, and ready to be exploited by anyone patient enough to wait for the perfect moment. That moment arrived when temperatures dropped. Ukraine launched a series of coordinated strikes that weren't random explosions. They were targeted blows against the pillars supporting Russia's entire military presence. High-value fuel storage sites were hit first because Ukraine understood that a tank without fuel is nothing more than metal. By destroying or freezing fuel reserves, Ukraine forced Russia into crisis mode. Suddenly, Moscow wasn't planning offensives. It was scrambling to keep units from grinding to a halt. The brilliance of this strategy lies in how much damage a single hit could cause. When a large depot went up in flames, it didn't just burn supplies, it burned Russia's ability to replace them quickly enough to maintain operational tempo. But Ukraine didn't stop at fuel. Supply trucks became prime targets, especially those stuck on winter roads slowed by ice, fog, and mechanical failures. A convoy worth hundreds of millions could be crippled by destroying a single vehicle at the front or back of the line. That is the hook that makes this moment so dramatic. With one well-placed drone or missile, Ukraine could turn a multi-billion-dollar logistics chain into a static, frozen wall of steel. Russia was forced to abandon trucks, reroute through dangerous terrain, and move supplies in smaller, more vulnerable batches. Each workaround made the logistics system slower, more expensive, and more exposed. Ukraine also struck rail hubs, the beating heart of Russia's military movement. These hubs were critical for transporting fuel, ammunition, and troops across vast distances. By targeting switching points, control centers, and loaded cargo wagons, Ukraine created cascading delays that rippled across entire regions. A single destroyed junction could delay thousands of tons of supplies for days. Suddenly, Russia's logistical advantage turned into a burden, a giant machine too slow and too rigid to adapt to rapid, unpredictable Ukrainian strikes. What elevates this into one of the most significant strategic moments of the war is how thoroughly the damage rippled through Russia's front lines. Soldiers found themselves rationing fuel. Artillery units had fewer shells. Armored vehicles were cannibalized for spare parts because replacements couldn't arrive fast enough. Even basic necessities, food, winter gear, medical supplies were delayed or lost. It didn't matter how many troops Russia had if those troops couldn't move, fight, or stay warm. And here is where the psychological impact becomes undeniable. A logistics collapse is not only about broken machines, it is about broken morale. Russian forces saw the effects of Ukraine's precision firsthand. Burning depots lighting up the night, abandoned trucks frozen solid on the roadside, rail lines severed with no clear timeline for repair. Confidence wavered. Commanders issued orders that could not be executed. Entire units slowed to a crawl, not because they lacked firepower, but because they lacked the essentials that keep an army alive. This is the hook that ties the entire point together. Ukraine didn't defeat Russia's logistics with overwhelming force. It defeated them with strategy, patience, and the knowledge that a $17.5 billion system can crumble just as easily as a cheap machine if you strike the right gears at the right moment. Ukraine's use of precision drone strikes on Russia's logistical choke points wasn't just a show of technological strength, it was a masterclass in modern asymmetric warfare. The hook here is undeniable. In a conflict where one side has numerical superiority, the other side wins by striking at the exact points where size becomes a weakness. And that is precisely what Ukraine did. It transformed Russia's massive logistics network into a sprawling, vulnerable target map where every bridge, every rail junction, every bottlenecked convoy became an opportunity to cause damage far greater than the cost of any drone launched into the sky. To understand the brilliance of this approach, you must first understand what a choke point truly represents. It isn't merely a narrow stretch of road or a congested supply hub. It's the place where military efficiency turns into military fragility. When hundreds of vehicles rely on a single route, when fuel for an entire region passes through one storage yard, when thousands of tons of ammunition depend on a single rail switch, the entire front line becomes hostage to that one location. Ukraine identified these critical nodes not by guesswork, but through meticulous intelligence, satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and real-time surveillance from a growing fleet of unmanned systems. This preparation meant that when a drone took flight, it rarely missed something important because it was never sent toward anything unimportant. The power of this strategy becomes even more striking when you consider how Russia organized its logistics. Long convoys moved in predictable patterns. Rail shipments followed rigid timetables. Fuel trucks traveled in groups large enough to draw attention, but small enough to be impossible to protect everywhere at once. Ukraine exploited that predictability with precision. Instead of expending resources on constantly shifting frontline targets, it redirected the fight toward the arteries, feeding the war. And by hitting choke points, Ukraine turned every strike into a force multiplier. Destroying one bridge did not simply delay one convoy, it forced dozens of others to take longer, more dangerous routes. Damaging a rail junction didn't eliminate one train, it paralyzed the entire route behind it. The psychological dimension of these strikes is equally important. Russian commanders understood that a single drone hovering above a narrow road at night could halt hundreds of vehicles because no driver wanted to be the one chosen by fate. Convoys sat still for hours, engines running, fuel burning, all while Ukrainian operators watched from miles away, waiting for the perfect moment. That moment usually came when the delay itself had already magnified the impact. When the first strike hit, often at the front or rear of a slow-moving line, the entire convoy was trapped. One burning truck became a barricade. One damaged fuel tanker contaminated the ice-covered road. One disabled armored transport turned into a traffic jam stretching for miles. Ukraine also recognized that not all targets needed to be destroyed outright. Disrupting a choke point sometimes meant simply making it unusable. A drone could drop a small munition onto a key switching mechanism on a rail line, and suddenly trains could no longer move through the area. A convoy could be stalled by damaging a single bridge support, even if the bridge didn't fully collapse. These soft kills were cheap, repeatable, and devastatingly effective because they forced Russia to either commit significant repair resources or abandon the route entirely. And in winter conditions, repair often meant wait, because frozen steel and icy terrain slow down everything, especially large armies. What makes this entire approach so engaging is how cleanly it demonstrated the shifting nature of modern warfare. Russia invested billions in tanks, artillery, and armored vehicles, but these expensive assets could do nothing without the steady flow of fuel and ammunition that moved through a limited number of high-pressure channels. Ukraine understood this imbalance instinctively. By using drones that cost a fraction of the equipment they destroyed or stalled, Ukraine flipped the cost equation upside down. A $20,000 drone could halt a $200 million convoy. A handful of FPV drones could paralyze a supply line worth billions. This asymmetry wasn't just strategic, it was symbolic. It showed the world that innovation can defeat mass and speed can defeat size. And the hook that ties all of this together is the quiet inevitability of it. While Russia believed that its logistical machine was too large to be crippled, Ukraine saw the opposite. The larger the machine, the more vulnerable its joints. By focusing on choke points, Ukraine didn't just slow Russia down, it forced Russia into a constant state of logistical panic, where every route became a risk and every delay became a potential disaster. The drones didn't just strike targets. They struck confidence, predictability, and the rhythm of Russia's war effort itself. Russia's overestimation of its winter advantage is one of the most revealing chapters of this conflict, not because winter traditionally favors Russian forces, but because Moscow misread the battlefield, misread the era, and misread its opponent. The hook here is striking. Russia entered the winter believing it carried the weight of history behind it, but Ukraine entered the winter with the power of modern strategy, real-time intelligence, and the ability to weaponize timing in a way Russia simply never anticipated. What unfolded was not the repeat of past Russian triumphs, it was the collapse of a myth that winter itself would shield Russia from its own logistical weaknesses. For decades, Russian military planners clung to the legend that cold weather hardens their troops and softens their enemies. It was a comfortable narrative, one reinforced by centuries of conflict in which foreign armies crumbled under icy conditions. But history does not repeat itself just because a nation wills it to. Ukraine understood that the advantage no longer lies in who can endure the cold, but in who can exploit the vulnerabilities the cold exposes. Winter does not protect an army that relies on long, rigid supply lines. Winter does not favor a force whose logistical system is already strained even in ideal weather. And winter certainly does not rescue a military that cannot move fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements with the speed and reliability required for modern combat. Russia walked into a season expecting an ally and found an adversary. What makes this shift so compelling is that Russia's confidence became its blind spot. By assuming winter would naturally slow Ukraine down, Russia slowed itself down. Commanders deployed units, believing the season would stall the enemy, yet the season stalled them instead. Engines froze, field equipment malfunctioned, fuel thickened. Winter clothing shortages surfaced in frontline units. Vehicles needed twice the maintenance and delivered half the performance. While Russia grappled with these issues, Ukraine adapted. Ukrainian forces used drones unaffected by cold, morale, or exhaustion, precision-guided munitions that didn't care about snow cover, and real-time surveillance that cut through fog and frost with thermal eyes. The battlefield didn't freeze, only Russia's expectations did. Another hook emerges in the psychology of miscalculation. Russia's belief in winter superiority was so deeply embedded that commanders dismissed early signs of trouble. When convoys slowed, they blamed terrain. When fuel shortages worsened, they blamed sabotage. When drones began striking with increasing accuracy, they blamed Western support rather than acknowledging the underlying truth. They had misread the season entirely. Ukraine anticipated the cold weather problems long before Russia responded to them, giving Ukrainian planners time to map every logistical weakness Russia would face once temperatures dropped. This wasn't just a physical battlefield, it was a psychological one, and Russia was fighting ghosts of past wars rather than the reality in front of them. Ukraine understood something Russia didn't. Winter is no longer a hero in warfare. It's a destabilizer, a variable. A force that punishes the unprepared, not the enemy. Modern machinery demands precise fuel temperatures, functioning electronics, and uninterrupted supply movement. These requirements don't disappear simply because a nation has a legacy of winter resilience. Russia underestimated how harshly winter punishes outdated planning. And Ukraine exploited this with a precision that turned Russia's overconfidence into a structural collapse. The real turning point came when Russia realized that winter wasn't slowing Ukraine down, it was accelerating Ukraine's effectiveness. Drone operators used cold air to carry their aircraft farther. Thermal imagery became sharper against frozen landscapes. Target visibility improved because heat signatures popped against the icy ground. What Russia believed would be a shield became a spotlight, exposing their convoys, revealing their fuel depots, and highlighting every logistical misstep. Ukraine didn't have to search for targets. Winter guided its eyes. Morale became another casualty of miscalculation. Russian soldiers were told winter would give them an upper hand, yet they found themselves freezing beside idle vehicles, rationing diesel, and waiting hours or days for supplies that never arrived. Disillusionment spread. Commanders issued orders that could not be followed. Units dug deeper into defensive positions, not out of strategy, but out of necessity. Winter wasn't holding Ukraine back, it was cornering Russia. Here is the hook that ties this key point together. Russia didn't lose its winter advantage because Ukraine was lucky. Russia lost it because Ukraine understood the one truth. Moscow ignored winter, doesn't choose a side. It chooses the army that adapts the fastest. And in this war, that army was not Russia. That army was Ukraine. Ukraine's strategy during the winter months was defined not by noise, spectacle, or overwhelming displays of force, but by an almost eerie calm, a deliberate, calculated stillness that concealed a devastating intent. The hook here is powerful. Sometimes the strongest strategy is not the one that strikes first, but the one that waits until the enemy is stretched so thin, so overconfident, and so distracted that a single well-timed blow unravels everything. Ukraine mastered that art. Its winter campaign was not a sprint or a gamble. It was the disciplined application of silence, patience, and surgical precision, the kind of strategy that doesn't just defeat an opponent, but exposes the structural flaws they hoped would stay hidden. For weeks, Ukraine tracked Russia's logistical rhythms as temperatures fell. It watched how supply routes slowed, how convoys became longer and less protected, how fuel depots grew vulnerable because demand surged faster than delivery. Ukraine gathered data not just on where Russia stored its supplies, but when those supplies were most exposed, when guard rotations thinned from exhaustion, when drones would be least expected because weather grounded conventional reconnaissance. This wasn't passive observation, it was the methodical tightening of a strategic noose. And when the cold finally hit with full force, Ukraine knew exactly where and when to apply pressure. The brilliance of this strategy lies in its restraint. Ukraine didn't waste resources on targets that offered only symbolic victories. It focused exclusively on nodes of vulnerability, rail chokepoints, frozen highways, depots overfilled in anticipation of winter offensives, and convoy routes narrowed by icy terrain. Ukraine understood what too many commanders forget. You don't need to destroy everything. You only need to destroy the right things. A single drone strike on a column stalled by winter conditions could freeze hundreds of vehicles in place. One attack on a fuel storage tank during a cold snap could render thousands of liters of fuel unusable, even if not directly destroyed. The elegance of these operations was their efficiency, maximum effect from minimal action. This slow, silent strategy also carried a psychological punch. Russia expected winter to dull Ukraine's momentum. Instead, it sharpened it. As the world watched snow fall, Ukrainian commanders saw opportunity falling with it. Their strikes became more targeted, more punishing, and more disruptive precisely because Russia wasn't prepared to defend against them during a season they believed was theirs. That is the hook. Ukraine weaponized not only the environment, but Russia's expectations of the environment. It let Russia walk into the trap of its own assumptions. Every Ukrainian strike during this period carried layered impacts. Destroying a truck wasn't about the truck, it was about the ripple that stretched across the entire convoy. Damaging a bridge wasn't about the structure, it was about the dozens of supply routes forced to reroute into even more dangerous terrain. Disabling a rail switch had consequences that flowed backward for miles, freezing supply movements across multiple regions. Ukraine turned winter delays into strategic multipliers. The colder it became, the more severe the consequences of every strike, the more Russia tried to compensate, the more predictable and vulnerable its logistics became. Another crucial dimension of this quiet strategy was its ability to mask intent. Because Ukraine avoided dramatic offensives or high-casualty confrontations, Russia underestimated the scale of the threat. Commanders misread silence as weakness and interpreted reduced frontline clashes as operational fatigue. Ukraine encouraged that perception because it needed Russia to let its guard down, and Russia did. It shifted forces, consolidated supply lines in ways that increased vulnerability, and postponed preventative actions, assuming Ukraine was too bogged down by the cold to strike effectively. Ukraine's silence created the illusion of safety, and Russia fell for it. What makes this key point so compelling is how deeply it underscores the role of intelligence and timing in modern warfare. Ukraine didn't need to match Russia's firepower. It needed to match and surpass Russia's understanding of the battlefield's shifting conditions. Winter wasn't a pause, it was an accelerant. And Ukraine used its drones, long-range precision weapons, and growing network of intelligence sources to turn winter into a force multiplier. Russia was preparing for a static, frozen front. Ukraine was preparing for a dynamic, precision-driven battlefield where every Russian weakness expanded in the cold. Here is the hook that defines the entire strategy. The winter campaign wasn't about striking harder. It was about striking smarter at the exact moment when Russia was least capable of responding. The silence before each attack became its own weapon, a psychological pressure that Russia never fully recognized until Ukraine's slow, methodical strategy revealed its devastating results. Ukraine's winter campaign revealed a truth that militaries often overlook. Logistics is not the background of war, logistics is the war. The hook here is sharp and undeniable. An army does not lose when it runs out of soldiers. It loses when it runs out of the things that keep soldiers alive. Ukraine understood this with absolute clarity. Russia did not. And in that gap between operational discipline and operational illusion, Ukraine found the space to deliver blows that didn't just weaken Russia's front line, but hollowed out the very system holding that front line together. When Ukraine attacked Russia's logistics network, it wasn't striking blindly or recklessly. It was attacking the bloodstream of an army that depends on constant, uninterrupted flow. Fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, spare parts, winter clothing, food. These are not luxuries. They are oxygen. Without them, even the largest, most heavily armed military begins to suffocate. Ukraine recognized that Russia's entire war machine depended on a limited number of predictable, overworked supply routes. These routes were long, exposed, and already strained by distance, weather, and mismanagement. So Ukraine made a decision that has defined modern conflict. Instead of fighting the spear, fight the hand that holds it. This strategy exposed how deeply Russia misunderstood the nature of the war it was fighting. Instead of building flexibility into its logistics network, Russia relied on rigid Soviet-era structures, assuming their size alone would protect them. But the hook is this. The bigger the system, the harder it is to defend. Ukraine turned this truth into a weapon. Every strike on a rail junction forced Russia to shift to trucks. Every strike on a convoy forced Russia to stretch its supply lines thinner. Every hit on a fuel depot forced Russia to redistribute precious reserves across too many fronts. And with each adjustment, Russia created new vulnerabilities that Ukraine could exploit with even greater precision. The cumulative effect was staggering. On the ground, Russian units felt the pressure almost immediately. Artillery batteries received fewer shells and were forced to ration fire. Armored columns stalled because fuel arrived in irregular, unpredictable quantities. Infantry formations waited days for winter gear that, in many cases, never came. Vehicles broke down more frequently due to cold weather, and because spare parts were delayed or lost, many units resorted to cannibalizing equipment, stripping one machine to keep another barely functional. This is where the hook tightens. Once logistics collapses, everything collapses. Not dramatically, not explosively, but slowly, steadily, and inevitably. The psychological impact was even more severe than the physical one. Russian soldiers who expected winter dominance instead found themselves freezing in trenches, staring at empty supply crates and malfunctioning gear. They watched as Ukrainian drones hovered overhead, picking off isolated trucks or striking convoys so perfectly timed that it became clear Ukraine had mastered the pulse of Russia's logistical system. Morale eroded. Distrust in commanders grew. Rumors of shortages spread faster than supplies did. Soldiers began to realize that the might of the Russian military meant nothing if the essentials didn't reach them in time. This is what makes Ukraine's strategy so professionally brilliant. It didn't need to break Russian lines in dramatic fashion. It broke the foundation under those lines. And as that foundation cracked, Russia started spending more effort trying to fix its logistical failures than focusing on its battlefield objectives. Ukraine